hopefully. Anyway, we are looking forward to our 7th installment on Precepts and Principles of the Torah. If you're not aware of what we have been doing, we are going through Yahweh's Law, first 5 books. We're actually specifically going through, starting in the book of Exodus, and trying to discover all the various principles that we can seek to apply to our life, which are found in the law, in Yahweh's Torah. The word Torah in the Hebrew is the word for law, translated law, but it actually means teaching and instruction. And so we're going through these scriptures. I'm going through Exodus 21, the last 6 weeks, part of 22, and now we're on our 7th week, and it's been an exciting ride so far, and seeing there's a lot covered there here in Exodus 21 and 22, a lot of different things covered at once, and I think Yahweh is sort of giving them a quick overview of His expectations, and so we have here in Exodus 21, 22, 23, a lot of real quick legislation, some judgments for the judges of Israel, and so on. You know, a lot of times people look at the law as being something outdated, antiquated, something that's not really for today, nothing to really pay much attention to. And it's kind of been, I don't know, not really been magnified. It's been kind of blasphemed. And but there's a lot of really, really good, sound biblical instruction here. And so we want to get back to magnifying the law. And so anyway, our angle we're going to look at this time, Exodus chapter 22, there's a lot of scriptures here given about responsibility, what it means to be a responsible person, responsible with possessions, responsible, as we're going to see here, young men, and responsible fathers, and things like that we're going to see as we go through Exodus chapter 22. And so what we want to do here is we want to be like Messiah. He lived in an era when the law of Yahweh was seen as being oppressive. It was oppressive because yet man had added all kinds of commandments to the law that Yahweh never approved of or sanctioned. And so we're going to do what Messiah did. This is actually a prophecy about the Messiah. Isaiah 42:21 says, Yahweh is well pleased for his righteousness' sake. And it says, he will exalt the law and make it honorable. And so that's what I want to do. The law has not been held in esteem in our generations, and the time that we live in is considered to be old, outdated. There's a new law now given by Messiah in the New Testament, but and there are some things, some scriptures that people like to point out here in different areas of the Torah, which people would say slavery and different things are evidence that this is old. We don't live this way anymore. This doesn't apply anymore, and so I disagree. I think it does apply, and but we need to understand it properly first before we apply. So, what is a right understanding of these things that we are reading? And so we're going to go into these, and some of these, as we start off with, are very basic, very simple, and for any society can look at these and, for the most part, could find agreement with the things that are being taught here. We see here Exodus 22 verse 5. If a man causes a field or vineyard to be grazed, and lets loose his animal, and it feeds in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best of his own field and from the best of his own vineyard. So just simple justice here. If somebody suffers loss as a result of another person's neglect, in this case, the irresponsible one would pay restitution from the best of his own vineyard or field. So the principle here is that we are responsible for the animals that are in our care. We are responsible for their actions. And we are expected to be in control of what our animals do. And so if you have, for instance, grazing animals, and your fence fails, and your animals, gets into your neighbor's garden, you're supposed to make restitution from the best of your own garden, best of your own field, or if you don't have anything like that, make restitution in some area. For instance, goats in particular have a tendency to escape fences. And if you have a fence and it gets into your neighbor's garden, then Yahweh would want you to make full restitution for what your animal did. Or as we read earlier, a week or two ago, about if an ox gores a man, if your ox was known to be dangerous to human life in the past, you could actually be the one responsible for the death of another person. And so we do have a responsibility. When we choose to take on animals, then we have a responsibility for their actions, whether it's a dog or a donkey or a horse or a goat or a sheep or any animal that's in our care. And that is a biblical principle. Moving on to verse 6, it says, if fire breaks out and catches in thorns, so that stacked grain, standing grain, or the field is consumed, he who kindled the fire shall surely make restitution. Once again, simple justice. If you set a fire and it gets out of control and it damages somebody else's property, obviously you should make proper restitution for the property that you damaged. It all has to do with responsibility. We can teach these things to our children when they're young. If one child takes the toy of another child and damages it somehow, or whatever, something along those lines, we should teach our children, there's a boundaries here. This is somebody else's belonging and you damaged it. And, we can teach them these things at a young age. Once again, just very simple justice here. We see also in verse 7, it says, if a man delivers to his neighbor money or articles to keep, and it is stolen out of the man's house, if the thief is found, he shall pay double. If the thief is not found, then the master of the house shall be brought to the judges to see whether he has put his hand into his neighbor's goods. For any kind of trespass, whether it concerns an ox, donkey, sheep, or clothing, for anything any kind of lost thing which another person claims to be his, the cause of both parties shall come before the judges, and whomever the judges condemn shall pay double to his neighbor. Now, it's once again, very simple, obvious, fair justice here. Now, an interesting note about this particular scripture. If you look here at this word, judges, the Hebrew word translated judges, judges, is the Hebrew word Elohim. And so it says, the master of the house shall be brought to, and in Hebrew it reads, Ha Elohim, or the Elohim. And which, if you are aware of this, Hebrew word Elohim is most commonly translated God. But in this instance, they did not translate it, shall be brought to the gods, or to the God. They translated it as the judges. You see, the Hebrew word Elohim is actually a much broader term than our English word God. And another example of this is seen in Jonah. In chapter 3, verse 3, it says that Jonah arose and went to Nineveh according to the word of Yahweh. And now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, a 3-day journey in extent. The word translated exceedingly here is the Hebrew word Elohim. And so it's translated judges, it's translated exceedingly, and so Nineveh was an Elohim great city. Now, take a time, if you got it, to look this up in a concordance, or if you got eSword or something. And another example, Proverbs 3:27, do not withhold good from those to whom it's due when it is in the power of your hand to do so. So this case, El, from which we get Elohim, is translated power. And so El, or Elohim, which is the plural version or plural intensive version, has to do with power, with strength, and with might. And so when Yahweh is telling them to bring their items to the judges, that would be to the mighty men, to the men who have power, to the men who can execute justice. And so really, maybe the best translation of the Hebrew word Elohim would be mighty or powerful. And so, but maybe there's not really any one-for-one accurate translation across the board. And so, for that reason, I typically use the word Elohim instead of translating it. But we see here pretty clearly that the term Elohim is much broader than our English word God would imply. And the word Elohim can refer to men, unlike God. God does not refer to men. It refers to the Supreme Being. And so there's some theological implications of that. If you look in the archives, the video archives, I've got a couple studies on Trinity and oneness. And take a look at those two studies sometime, and I go into that in more detail. So, all right. Continuing on here to verse 10. It says, if a man delivers to his neighbor a donkey, an ox, or sheep, or any animal to keep, and it dies, is hurt, or driven away, no one seeing it, then an oath of Yahweh shall be between them both, that he has not put his hand into his neighbor's goods, and the owner of it shall accept that, and he shall not have, he won't have to make it good. See, this is one of the few places in the Bible where Yahweh actually commands that an oath would be made. And the purpose of an oath is to settle the dispute. And we see this actually in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 16. It says, for men indeed swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is for them an end of all dispute. Now some would say, well, didn't Yahshua say not to swear at all by heaven, by earth? Now the context of that was, in a normal conversation, you shouldn't have to go around having to uphold your words all the time with various levels of swearing. But in a court system situation, where you're appearing before Yahweh and before the judges, and you are appearing before Yahweh because those who stand in that place of judgment are standing in the place of Elohim. As it says in Romans, they don't bear the sword in vain. The powers that exist are appointed by Elohim. So you're standing in this place and essentially making this oath before Elohim. And so there is a distinction here. And we are actually told that one day every knee shall bow, every tongue shall swear and say, in Yahweh I have righteousness and strength. And so that's in Isaiah. But so we do see that there are clear directives given in these instances. And so I don't necessarily think it's wrong that our court systems today, might employ the use of oaths. I don't know that it should be necessary, that every word you speak is an oath in a court of law. That doesn't seem to be biblical at all. But what does seem to be is if there are two people, one's accusing the other, and the one person, under oath would be willing to deny that this occurred, or, say this is what happened, give their testimony of what happened, then that might be different. And so it's not the same context that the Messiah was speaking of. And again, in the archives, I've kind of covered that fairly thoroughly recently. I think it was in September of the Roman year. There's a study entitled, There's Not So Much New Under the Sun. That's S-O-N. And we go into that sermon that Yahushua gave. All right, so returning to Exodus here, it says, but if in fact it is stolen from him, he shall make restitution to the owner of it. If it's torn to pieces by a beast, then he shall bring it as evidence, and he shall not make good what was torn. And so we have a responsibility to restore something that was in our care and yet was stolen by men. But, let's say a lion comes along and devours the animal. I mean, this is not necessarily within the owner's ability to stop. And so he would bring the evidence and, maybe the leftover bones or something like that the animal was torn, and wasn't required to restore that. And the same thing could just as easily have happened to the owner, that something could happen. So we should be able to keep our items safe from thieves, but we cannot necessarily do anything about keeping it, lions and bears coming to attack or something. So, continuing on, verse 14, if a man borrows anything from his neighbor and it becomes injured or dies, the owner of it not being with it, he shall surely make it good. If its owner was with it, he shall not make it good. If it was hired, it came for its hire. All right, and this is the case of belongings. We're not talking animals here now. All right, so it's common today, wouldn't you say, that you let somebody borrow something and it belongs to you, and then you get it back and it's all tore up, wasn't taken care of. So this is the case of animals. But also, I think we can apply this to other things. And you get this, you let somebody borrow your car, and it comes back as got damage on it, or let them borrow your lawnmower, and the blades are all tore up, or you let them borrow a tool, and the tool's all damaged, and so they tear it up, and Yahweh says that the one who borrows it is responsible for taking care of it, and has to repay the owner if they return it in damaged or ruined condition. And exception is made if the owner is there. or say if it was rented for hire. There may be some common sense exceptions to that, normal wear and tear on machinery and so on. But, speaking of, this specifically here, the principle is that when you borrow something from somebody else, take care of it, And we can teach our children too. Again, we can teach our children this at a young age, and employ these verses in the Torah as righteous judgment. If they borrow their brother or sister's item and it comes back as torn up, then they should make proper restitution. All right, now moving on to the big one here. It says in Exodus 22, verse 16, it says, if a man entices a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money according to the bride price of virgins. All right, so first of all, we see a biblical principle that a father has the right of refusal when it comes to, his daughter marrying a man. He has the right to refuse that. And Yahweh said here, fornication is occurring. The woman's a virgin. The man's required to marry the girl and pay the bride price, but not if the father utterly refuses. And so Yahweh himself respects the right of refusal that a father would have concerning his daughter. Now, this is there to protect the daughter from, in this case, an irresponsible man who is not going to properly take care of her and so on, or for any reason. You don't treat my daughter that way. And yet the man would still have to pay money according to the bride price of virgins. So, now some people would look at this and say, this dowry system, this bride price system, what is this? I mean, the man comes and buys his wife. This sounds like women are treated, like something less than, as if they're property, that's like cattle, or something you come along and you go window shopping and you buy it. And I've sadly have run across individuals who do treat their wives and women in general as if they're property, as if they are cattle, as if they're not really created in the image of Elohim and are very valued in Yahweh's eyes, but instead are just some kind of possession that is owned by a man. And that is the furthest thing from what this is really all about. What is this bride price thing? What is this really all about? Number one, it's to ensure responsibility on the part of the man and accountability on the part of the man, and it essentially eliminated womanizers in Israel. Womanizers treat women like cattle. Men who go around and commit fornication with various women, they're the one treating women like something cheap to be used for your own pleasure. Yahweh chose, we see here, to go along with, and maybe he even instituted the idea of a dowry being made as part of the marital covenant. And I think when you really examine it, it makes a lot of sense as to why it would have been established. Consider the reasons here. First of all, for a man to just marry somebody, he couldn't be just some irresponsible person come along and says, "Oh, I'm going to marry this woman," first of all, I had to go through the father, and second of all, he had to have some financial security. I mean, you don't just go along and have a dowry in your hand unless you have done some kind of work in order to save up for and have a dowry. I mean, besides the fact you're going to have a home for her to go to, you would have had to have prepared a place for your future bride. You would need to have some kind of financial security to, already established. And this would help to guarantee that the woman whom a young man would marry would have some kind of financial integrity. And so, right off the bat, we see this is something to protect the young girl. And so, secondly, the institution of marriage is something considered to be something valuable, something that a man would have to take seriously, knowing that he couldn't just marry her and divorce her a month later if he didn't like her. He would actually suffer loss if he were to do something like that. And so marriage was considered to be a step that would require commitment. And if a man thought he could go around and fornicate and get away with not having the commitment involved, he had another thing coming. And that's why, not even maybe 150 years ago, you hear things like shotgun weddings, not even 50 years ago, you might say, that wasn't unheard of, where, the husband would make sure that there's going to be a marriage there. And the idea of a divorce was so uncommon, even 100 years ago in our nation. There's such a stigma against it that, once you're married, you're married. And the father of the bride was there to be the protector of his daughter in that marital relationship. And if the man was abusing his daughter, the daughter could just go to her father, and the father would, have ways of making sure that his daughter was protected, either through court system or, unfortunately for the man, vigilante justice. So, anyway, the marriage institution was something considered to be a major step. You had to be sure that you were ready for. You don't just throw money around, because money's labor. That's work. All right. Thirdly, boyfriend-girlfriend relationships with no responsibility is essentially eliminated. You don't have young men, catting around when you have a dowry that they're going to have to pay along with marriage. And if they don't have the money to pay the dowry, what happens? They become slaves because they don't have any money. So then they have to sell themselves. In this case, it would become the slave or the servant. And I'm not talking American-like slavery. I'm talking about biblical slavery, 6 years maximum, not to be mistreated, not to be abused. But and if you don't understand what that means, what I just now said about biblical slavery, go back into the archives. 3 weeks ago, I shared a study completely based on what biblical slavery really is. But anyway, but there wouldn't be this, boyfriend gets their daughter somebody pregnant and then, walks away and like nothing ever happened. That just wouldn't happen in Israel. And so this fornication lifestyle, there wouldn't be there. The boyfriend-girlfriend relationship thing with no responsibility attached would be eliminated. And so they didn't have boyfriend-girlfriend games in Israel. And so the alternative then is, once again, I would ask you to go into the archives. If you go to the top of EliYah.com, click archives, there is a 7-part video series on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Watch the first part. And you'll find that there is an alternative system to the boyfriend-girlfriend game where neither the man or the woman comes into the marriage having been damaged by past relationships. Okay. Now the 5th advantage. Biblical love. Biblical love and the importance of valuing women is established before the marriage even takes place. Now you might wonder what that means. Think for a minute about Jacob. I mean, we all know the story of Jacob being willing to work 7 years for Rachel. Pretty steep bride price, to work 7 years for a young girl to be married to. Now you notice, though, that to Jacob, it seemed just but a few days to him. Now, to us, in our Western, Gentile, Grecianized, Romanized society, we might think, well, for Jacob, each day, wouldn't it just kind of tick along slowly and, another day? And because he would want Rachel so badly, to be his wife. But that's not biblical love. See, that's a love based on what self gets. Modern day love is this, based on what the other person does for you. See? How they serve you, how they make you feel. And that's the basis of a lot of boyfriend-girlfriend type relationships. Oh, he makes me feel so wonderful. Oh, he makes me feel this, he makes me feel that. Or she makes me feel this way. Therefore, I love her. You see? But biblical love is not based on what you get. Biblical love is serving the other person. Biblical love is what you give. The exact opposite. And how you serve them. If you really love someone, then you serve them. If you just love yourself, then you're always looking what you can get out of the deal. And many of our marital relationships are based on what the other person does for you rather than what you do for the other person. Even go back 50 years or so, there was a man named John F. Kennedy. He said, "Ask not what your country may do for you, but what you may do for your country." It's all for the love of country, right? Well, what about that? Can't we apply that in our marriage situations? And I'm not claiming I'm perfected in this by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not in what your spouse will do for you. You don't worry about that. You ask, what can you do for your spouse? That's biblical love. And so we see here how biblical love would be established before there was ever a marriage, because the man had to work. The man had to work for the wife. He's already serving her. He's already working for her. And Yahweh wanted the man to enter into the marriage with this mindset that before you even get married, you value the one you're marrying. And it's not just based on selfishness and what you get, but a true love is based on the man serving her. And so to Jacob, 7 years, that's nothing. That's nothing for Rachel. Wow, just for Rachel? Well, 7 years? Hey, I'll work 7 years. That's how valuable Rachel was to him. Do we get this now? Do we understand that? It's not about what self gets. And that's the whole problem with our society and the way it views love. But Yahweh loved us, and he demonstrates that love by what he has done for us. Yahshua is our bridegroom. What did he give? He was valued by men at only 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver. Price of a slave. Yahshua valued us so much, he purchased us with his own blood. And so, Paul is admonishing the Ephesians here in Acts 20, verse 28. And he tells them, take heed to yourselves and to all the flock, among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the assembly of Elohim, which he purchased with his own blood. Think about this. Your fellow believers in Messiah, Yahshua valued so much, he purchased with his own blood. That's how valuable your brothers and sisters in the faith are. And so, if Yahshua was willing to value us so much that he would be willing to lay down his life for us, that's how much he valued us. How much more, shouldn't we also value each other? Shouldn't we also care when one part of the body is hurting? Shouldn't we have that same zeal for our brothers and sisters in the faith? Yahweh help us all. And so this would especially be true concerning how us men, we're talking about responsibility today, ought to value our wives. Ephesians 5:25, husbands, love your wives, just as Messiah also loved, I don't like the word church, I'm going to say congregation here, and gave himself for her. He gave his life for her. And so we also ought to be willing. And that's why, brothers, it's the men who will go out to war. It's the men who will go out and fight for the homeland. It's the men who would protect their households with their life against intruders, against those who would harm. And women need to value that. Value that security and show the needed respect. So he gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word. So we are cleansed by Messiah's words. Our wives are cleansed by our words of affirmation and encouragement, that he might present her to himself a glorious assembly, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, so that she should be holy and without blemish. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, because they are one flesh with us. And so, biblical love has to do with what you do for the other person, less so what you get out of the deal. And that's the root of so many of our marital problems, is we're all thinking about what the other person does for us rather than what we do for the other person. And so there are advantages here, brothers, of this dowry system, which I believe is far superior to what we see going on today. It's a mess, what we see going on today. It's a disaster, what we see going on today, with women being cheapened and pornography and advertisements, and it's all about the flesh and what the man gets. It's not about what the man will give. It's about what the man gets. Whereas what Yahweh is doing here, he's establishing from the outset, the man will give. And of course, the other way we have of doing things is it provokes weaknesses in the women when they don't feel valued, that they in turn seek to take the reins. So, but you know, the man, the woman's father has a responsibility to see to it that the person that she marries is someone who is going to be responsible, and he has the right to refuse. If the man does not, if the father does not believe his daughter is going to be loved and cherished and valued by the man, then he had the right to refuse the marriage, even though Yahweh said they should get married. But either way, the man would be required, we see in Exodus there, to pay that bride price. No matter what, you're paying the bride price. And you're paying the bride price of virgins whether you marry her or not. And so now you notice here that the young girl seems to be absolved of any real responsibility. There's no punishment mentioned for her. And so what we have here is Yahweh is holding the men responsible for keeping themselves pure and for not enticing females. And so this is all about man and the man's side of things and his responsibility to be men. I mean, to be people who are not just flippant and treating this step lightly, unlike what we see today. All right. Now there's another scripture we do need to examine here. This is an ever popular scripture by atheists and those who think the Bible is immoral, and that's found in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 28. It says, "If a man finds a young woman who is a virgin, who is not betrothed, and he seizes her and lies with her, and they are found out, then the man who lay with her shall give to the young one's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has humbled her. He shall not be permitted to divorce her all his days." Now, there is some lack of clarity here as to whether or not this is actually speaking of a rape situation. And some would suggest it's not actually a rape situation, because the verbiage here is a little different than other cases where rape is clearly intended. For instance, the woman, if she was betrothed, if a man finds a betrothed young woman in the countryside and the man forces her, in this case, we definitely have force, this is a different Hebrew word than the word seize, and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the young woman. There is in the young woman no sin deserving of death. For just as when a man rises against his neighbor and kills him, even so is this matter. And so the verbiage and the context appears to be a little different here. In this case, this says seizes her. Now, the NIV reads rape here, but I'm not 100% sure that's what this is, because the Hebrew word translated seizes is also translated play. Here in Genesis 4:21, it says his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the harp and flute. And so has to do with utilizing an instrument. And so now I'm not saying that this Hebrew word never can mean to do it by force, but the word does not necessarily mean to do it in a violent way. And whereas earlier verses, it was very clear that violence was the intent. All right, another reason. It says, if a man finds a young woman who is a virgin who is not betrothed, and he seizes her and lies with her, and they are found out, then the man who lay with her. Now, the fact that it would say they are found out, they would mean that both of them are found out, as if they were both guilty of doing something secretive here. And so that would be an indication, possibly, that there might be instances where they're not found out. And so Deuteronomy could simply be a revision or an extension of the previous precept in Exodus. Many times in Deuteronomy it's just repeating former precepts that were already given in Exodus, Numbers, and Leviticus. For instance, Exodus 20, we had the Ten Commandments given. Deuteronomy 5, 10 Commandments are given again. Only a little different angle on it, a little different precept in the way they're written, or an expansion or revision upon what the previous 10 Commandments had said. There's some little differences here, very subtle. And so it doesn't mean the former one was invalid, but that we have an expansion of what the former one would actually originally, the intent was. And so, however, I will acknowledge that there are some problems with that understanding, that it wasn't a rape. And one of the problems with that is, if it's only speaking of a voluntary act on the part of the virgin, then there wouldn't be any place in the Bible where, what do you do if it was not voluntary on her part? Now, to combat that thought, that line of reasoning, my own experience, just being in Israel in 2009, when we went to Israel, I was totally shocked because there were young women, teenage girls, early 20s, late teens, 10 o'clock at night, their thumb out, hitching a ride. Rape is not common over there. The society that's been built in both Islam and in Judaism is, you just don't do that. It's just they're raised differently. They don't have the society like we do. Now, increasingly over there, it's becoming more and more like ours. But that's not how it started. They were trying to establish, some kind of morality in the land. And so I could see where, rape would be something pretty much, very rare in ancient times. But we do see Yahweh addressing that, the rape occurring in the event of the woman being betrothed. And then he goes on and says, well, okay, and then if she's not betrothed. And so contextually, it does seem to favor that this is speaking of a man who is forcing himself upon an unbetrothed woman. For instance, we look here at the context. It says, Deuteronomy 22:23, if a young woman who is a virgin is betrothed to a husband, and a man finds her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of the city, and you shall stone them to death with stones. The young woman, because she did not cry out in the city, and the man, because he humbled his neighbor's wife. So you shall put away the evil from among you. But if a man finds a betrothed young woman in the countryside, and the man forces her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the young woman. There is nothing, as we read earlier, in the young woman, no sin deserving of death, for just as when a man arises against his neighbor and kills him, even so is this matter. For he found her in the countryside, and the betrothed young woman cried out, but there was no one to save her. Now, that was actually true in Israel, because in the city, their cities were very small. I've got 40 acres here, property at my house. That would have been plenty of room for a good-sized city in Israel. That would have been plenty of room. No problem at all. And because the fields were on the outside. People lived within the walls, the inside of the city. and they were stacked together. There's 4-room houses, and they're all up against each other, and sometimes they even lived inside the walls, and so it was almost like apartments in those days. And I think that's one reason why, people were so accountable. I mean, when you did something, everybody knew about it. Everybody knew everybody. And that's how it was actually in the United States before the invention of cars and stuff, where now everything's real spread out. But it used to be they built houses very close together. And, you didn't want to have to travel, 15 miles in a horse to go get some food for your family. So it was very different, and even in our nation, not all that long ago. All right, so when there was, in this case, in Israel, the countryside versus the city, if a woman cried out in the city, there would be people around to hear and to know what's going on. So, all right. So continuing along this thread, now he's just addressing, he's specific, he says betrothed in these cases, which betrothed in Yahweh's eyes is just as good as marriage. The dowry has been paid, betrothal has occurred. It takes a divorce to cancel a marriage that is in the engagement period. All right, so then then the next question obvious would be, well, what about if the unbetrothed woman was in a similar situation? And here we are. And so contextually, I'll have to acknowledge that this does appear certainly to be a rape situation. So how do we look at this? First of all, we need to understand 50 shekels of silver. 50 shekels of silver. All right. What was a shekel of silver worth in the time that Yahweh gave this? We see here that when Yahweh valued slavery, he said in Deuteronomy 15:18, he says, "It shall not seem hard to you when you send him away free from you, for he has been worth a double hired servant in serving you 6 years." All right. So a slave, according to the scripture here, is worth a double hired servant in the 6 years that he worked. Now, a slave was typically worth, as we've seen in earlier verses, 30 shekels of silver. And so, going by this, it appears to me that if you were to hire a servant instead of having this slave do the work, then it would have cost a person 60 shekels to get the kind of work involved here. All right. So if you keep that in mind, for a man to have worked, let's say he worked 6 years, then he would have gotten, say, 60 shekels. Well, why don't we just say then for 5 years would be 50 shekels. And so we have 5 years of hard labor worth of money that this person who did this forcing himself upon a woman would have had to pay. I'm just kind of trying to figure out what the shekel's worth. All right. So 30 shekels of silver would be the price of a slave, and normally it would have cost him 60 shekels to have that kind of labor. So we're looking at about 10 shekels a year. And so the man's not getting off scot-free here. We're talking 5 years worth of work that he would have to, and if he probably didn't have it. I mean, someone who's willing to do something like that probably didn't have it, and it's more likely that he would be sold into slavery. And so the man's not exactly getting off scot-free here. Now, just figure that up. I mean, what is even our own society? Let's say that the bare minimum will be $15,000 a year. you're looking at a fine of about $75,000. Okay? All right. And so it's not, chicken feed here that he is being fined for. But why didn't he have the man put to death, like we see in the other cases? Well, we need to remember that, first of all, if we look in other places, like in 2 Samuel 13, verse 11, it says, the case of when Tamar was in a situation where her brother Amnon was forcing himself upon her. And he said to her, "Lie with me, my sister." And she said, "No, my brother, do not force me. No such thing should be done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. And where could I take my shame? As for you, you would be like one of the fools in Israel. Now, therefore, please speak to the king. He will not withhold me from you." And so, the second thing that would happen to someone who forced himself upon a person is they would be like one of the fools in Israel. They would be ostracized, considered to be a foolish person. And we see here, however, he would not heed her voice, and being stronger than she, he forced her and lay with her. And then Amnon hated her exceedingly. So the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, "Arise, be gone." So she said to him, "No, indeed, this evil of sending me away is worse than the other that you did to me." But he would not listen to her. Now, why did she say this? Why did she say, "The evil of sending me away is worse"? Worse than the rape was send her away. I'm going to treat her like trash, basically. And so we see here Tamar, his sister, said he would be like a fool. Unlike today, there's a lot of accountability for your actions in Israel. Villages were small, people lived, they knew each other, and so he would have been considered to be a foolish person. What a way to live your life. Everyone look at you thinking you're a fool. Second of all, it would have been basically the equivalent of what we have today as these, sex offender lists and so on. You're going to get blinking lights, around you all the time. Everybody knows what shameful deed that you've done. And so that would have been automatically, they would have been on the sex offender list in Israel. Okay, so that would have happened already. And people would have known to stay away from them. And but unlike today, and I want to point this out, why she viewed this as being worse is because, unlike today, virginity was a highly prized thing in ancient culture. And so for a young girl to have lost her virginity, they would be very unlikely, to find a man who would be willing to marry her, because the high esteem that was placed on marrying a virgin. And this would especially be true, say, if a child were happened to have been born out of this act that occurred. And so when Yahweh allowed for the woman to marry the person who had done this, there would be cases in which this is something that the young woman wanted. And that was the case here with Tamar. And so, but this is simply the natural result of a culture where a very high value is placed on the virginity. Now, bear with me here. I'm not finished. Okay? But I want to point this out because it is very important that we understand this. Virginity was a very highly prized thing in ancient Israel. And the natural result of a culture in which virginity is such a highly prized thing is the woman, if she wasn't a virgin, would have a hard time getting married. And so what was better for the woman to live the rest of her life never having known the joy of raising children, never having known the joy of having a family and being married and all the benefits and the security that comes with that, or it would have been better for the two to get married. And so there were cases where this was the preferable thing. Now, some might say, well, if that's the case, maybe it's better now today that people don't value virginity so much. Well, it's true. I mean, virginity is not valued that much today. No, instead we have women being treated like cheap pieces of meat that you throw aside. Instead, we have boyfriend-girlfriend relationships that result in the loss of virginity. Instead, we have people today who are practicing marriage with all the obligations of monogamy expected as if they're married, but there's no commitment to each other. Instead of we have this lack of value placed on virginity. And we have tons and tons of unwanted pregnancies, millions and millions of abortions where little babies are killed in their mama's womb. Instead, we have irresponsible, deadbeat dads. Instead, we have children who have no father in their lives. That's the result of the system we have today, where virginity is not valued. And women, therefore, are not valued. And so what would this do to a father in Israel? This would make a father be very, very careful about protecting his young daughter. Not only did he have a vested interest in it as well, not just his daughter, but he had a vested interest in it as well, protecting his daughter. And so we as fathers, we need to protect our daughters, especially in today's obsessive culture with fornication and all these things. And even it doesn't matter what age they are anymore. It used to be you didn't have to worry about if they're 8, 9, 10 years old, but forget it nowadays. You have to always have your eyes open to what's going on. And so ancient Israel, they were very protective of their daughters. And even in our own society, there was a time when it was not a good idea for a woman to even go outside and cross the street by herself, simply because the father wanted to see to it his daughter was always protected and preserved. And so, I mean, it's sad, the result either way of sin. But what is better, that we don't value virginity or that we do value it? And so you might say, well, yeah, surely there'd be a young man who would, overlook what happened and just love the girl anyway. I agree. And that's why Yahweh allows the father a right of refusal. And so the father having the right of refusal was not an act to afflict his daughter, but it was an act to protect his daughter. Just the opposite. And you might say, well, the right of refusal is not really mentioned there in Deuteronomy. Nothing mentioned about the right of refusal. Well, it's already mentioned in Exodus. And so he didn't have to repeat himself. He didn't have to say over and over again, this is what ought to be done. It was already established that even though Yahweh himself expected to be a marriage in Exodus 22, the father, there's already been a precedent set in previous chapters that the father is able to refuse the marriage if he chooses. And so he didn't have to repeat the same thing about that. And so, if Yahweh himself respected the father's decision in regards to his right of refusal in the event of two young people getting together in fornication that was agreeable to each other, I mean, how much more so would he respect the right of refusal if the man forced himself upon her? Certainly. And so there was no need to repeat the principle because the precedent was already set up. in the book of Deuteronomy. And so rape was punished in Israel. It was. It's not that, but the ideal situation would have been the father had protected his daughter, and people don't live in a fornication charged society to where they even consider doing those things. So, all right. So let's continue on here. As we go along, we are reading now from Exodus 22:18. It says, "You shall not permit a sorceress to live." Interesting. Don't even let them live if they are committing these acts of sorcery. And so he has very, very high standard here. Don't even let them draw a breath on the earth. Okay. And we see Leviticus 19:31, "Give no regard to mediums and familiar spirits. Do not seek after them to be defiled by them." Leviticus 20, verse 6, "And the person who turns to mediums and familiar spirits to prostitute himself with them, I will set my face against that person and cut him off from his people." He considers that prostitution when you go after seeking the advice of demons. It's considered spiritual harlotry. In Leviticus 20:27, "A man or woman who is a medium or who has familiar spirits shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones. Their blood shall be upon them." You didn't mince words. Deuteronomy 18:10, "There shall be not found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through the fire, or one who practices witchcraft, or a soothsayer, or who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who conjures spells, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. For all who do such things, these things are an abomination to Yahweh. And because of these abominations, Yahweh your Elohim drives them out from before you." Serious business. All right. We go on to the New Testament if you'd like. If you don't think the standard is the same for any reason. Revelation 22, verse 14 says, "Blessed are those who do his commandments. They may have the right to the tree of life and may enter through the gates into the city. But outside are dogs, sorcerers, sexually immoral, murderers, idolaters, and whoever loves and practices a lie." So we've got the sorcerers right here in the middle of things, in the thick of things. Now, the reason why I'm bringing these up is because I think in our society today, we don't really treat it as being the abomination it really is. And because we see sorcery, magic, mediums, soothsaying, other occultic practices, they're glorified in our culture. I mean, nearly all the Disney movies, especially animated movies, they have magic and sorcery in them. The terms magic, wizard, are so carelessly used in our culture today. If someone's really good at computers, what do they call them? Especially if they're young people. Oh, computer whiz, right? Computer wizard. Wizard, he's wielded mastery over the computer. Little computer programs pop up, and the wizard will guide you through installing the program. It has the mastery over installing this program. And so these little terms are used so carelessly and flippantly, and our culture is so inundated with, magic and wizardry, and even the TV shows and even the commercials, they've got these special effects, to create illusions and tricks that would normally require the work of a magician or someone to accomplish. And these things are so common nowadays, it's real easy for us to not even think twice about it. And believers will set their children in front of movies that glorify sorcery, that glorify wizardry and magic, without really even thinking about it. But we need to think about this. I mean, what power are they calling upon to accomplish their supernatural deeds that they're doing? Are they doing these things in Yahshua's name there on the Disney program? I don't think so. I mean, are they humbling themselves before Yahweh and calling upon Him to intervene, and Yahweh's being glorified there in the answer? No. And so what power are they tapping into here? It's the power of Satan, the devil, that they're calling upon. When you see them doing magic wands and casting spells and all these things, I mean, so why would we set our children or even ourselves in front of a movie or something that would glorify the power of the devil and give him power you don't even have? I mean, no one can really do those things. But of course, the devil wants to make himself seem so mighty and powerful as if he can control all things. And really he can't. But he's glorified into something he really can't even do on these TV shows and the mass media. I mean, Disney in particular has this song, "When you wish upon a star, your dreams will come true." Don't you see that they're calling the children to tap into some unknown God? I mean, to have faith in a star or an idol to answer your prayers. And you'll notice at the opening of all the Disney movies, they have this little graphic that comes up, Disney graphic that, pops up with an accompanying little few notes of a song. And the few notes that they're playing is "When You Wish Upon a Star." Da 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 da. And here's the graphic of Disney. It's a Disney movie. And so what power are they really trying to convey here? I think there is more than likely people behind this whole thing who are very occultic minded, very pagan and occultic in their mindsets. And so I'm saying these things because it's not just Disney, it's other things. Because we need to develop, because a lot of us don't have it, a sensitivity to the things that Yahweh finds abominable, the things that He hates. And He hates those practicing witchcraft and soothsaying and interprets omens and sorcery and conjuring spells and mediums and spiritists. He says these are an abomination. Something that's an abomination is at the height of something Yahweh absolutely finds disgusting. And so when we see this Disney thing in front of us, or these magic things in front of us, we need to, if we really are people after Yahweh's own heart, then we really need to have His heart here and find that to be, yuck, disgusting, abomination. And today we may not have too many people literally bowing before an idol or worshiping the planets or the sun or moon, but when you wish upon a star, you're giving homage to one of the stars being your God that answers your prayers, some unknown force. Maybe it's to the unknown God or something. And that doesn't even mention the messages these movies give our children. I mean, Disney princesses are all the rage now. But how many more Disney movies there have to be made about how some young, mistreated little girl escapes from her caregiver's grasp and marries some handsome prince where they live happily ever after? I don't know how many Disney movies have been made with that same exact theme in it. And these movies are teaching girls, rebel against old-fashioned things, rebel against parental authority, and go find some guy to hook up with. And that's exactly what we see a lot of today. But, at any rate, the sorcery and the magic alone ought to be sending the alarm bells off in the hearts of believers. But it's just that we're so desensitized to it because the culture we live in is just so commonplace. But we need to seek again to be men and women after Yahweh's own heart in all of these areas. That's what we're called to be. All right. So I think I was going to continue, but I think we'll go ahead and go to the next one. I was going to not continue. I was going to stop right there, but I want to go ahead and move on to this next one here because oh, that's pretty gross one. But I think I'm going to go ahead and stop there because there are some other things I want to bring up besides what's actually written there in that verse 19 in Exodus 22. So, but what we're talking about here in this Exodus 22, and we can see this how it's become pervasive in the culture we live in, and that is, us as fathers and us as husbands, we have a responsibility to care about the persons that that we are with, the persons that are entrusted to us by Yahweh Himself, to be a people who protect. And are we doing that? Are we protecting our daughters? Are we valuing women the way Yahweh's called us to value women? Whether the woman happens to be our daughter, or the woman happens to be our wife, or if you're a young man, take a look here. Yahweh values women. He values the virginity of a young girl. And we young men have a responsibility before Yahweh to keep their hearts pure and to turn away their eyes when being tempted to lust and not cheapen the woman as some object of visual harlotry, but to value the woman. And that's exactly an expression of love to Yahweh. Because if you think about it, here was Adam by himself in the Garden of Eden. There he was. And he had no suitable person next to him that could be his partner in his life, that could be his confidant, that could be someone he could rely upon to live life with. And Yahweh said, all right, well, it's not good for man to be alone. I will make a comparable, a suitable helper to him. And so he took out of his side, not his foot, where she's underfoot, but his side, a suitable helper. And of course, when he woke up, she didn't have any clothes on. I'm sure he was pretty happy with what Yahweh had made, and so there's no doubt that he would have or should have cherished the gift that Yahweh had created for him. And that's really the biblical principle behind everything else that Yahweh says in regards to how we are to cherish, to care for, and to nourish our wives. And their number one need is to feel valued and to feel loved. And so we have that, brothers, sisters, or I should say brothers, to treat them as something that we value. And our young girls that grew up in our household, our daughters, we need to convey that. And I can say that, myself, I'm learning this more and more every day, just how valuable woman is. So this is a chapter about responsibility, and this is the responsibility that Yahweh has laid out for us men. Let's make sure that we are being responsible with our possessions. We're being responsible with the plan of marriage, Yahweh's institution of marriage, which He loves, and that we express love, that we express, words and things and deeds and things that we do, like Jacob, being willing to love in a way that involves serving. So, brothers and sisters, hope you've been encouraged by the message today. I've been convicted some too, myself, about some of the things I'm talking about here. Just it blows me away at, sometimes I'll give a message and I think I'm done writing it, but Yahweh finishes it for me. So, but we have to, brothers and sisters, heed these messages, and at the same time, I want to call upon the sisters to, pray for us men. I think we all need that prayer every day, because we have a huge, tall order before us to love as Messiah did, and that's not an easy task. In the meantime, we look forward to sharing more next week, and until then, Yahweh guide us all, and may Yahweh bless you, and may Yahweh have mercy on us all.